incident because it is also connected with us. That's why I'm looking on Facebook to know what new news we have, because it's really very important incident. That's why like I'm a little bit. Oh, we are live on Facebook already.
So should we start?
Yes, yes, yes.
So hello everyone. In today's world, on one hand, where everyone is running from morning to evening and thinking about to have a better and secure future. On contrary to that, we human beings in past 200 years, we have mentally defined all the ethics of the fragile relationship we have with this earth. This complexity in situation compels us to think closely about environment and climate crisis and climate change. So, welcome everybody. My name is Khushbu Sarasia, and I, with my friend David Peterson, today will be moderating this session. So, first, I would like to introduce our panel members. So, first, we have with us um, Ms. Ginny Wollaston, being a Quaker as well as arts director for the city of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Ginny's interest in peace and culture has called her to work on environmental issues such as climate change. She is associated with groups like Extinction Rebellion that calls for emergency legislation in the parliament for the climate crisis. Ginny is in the European coordination of the JRC. So welcome you, Ginny. Thank you so much for joining us today. So moving upon to, and also we also have Ms. Nadia Sarenki with us. She worked for Christian Aid for almost 20 years, and during that time has focused on mainly on Asia. Her role is with the policy, public affairs, and campaign team, and focused on inequality. But over the years, she has also written and advocated on issues such as gender-based violence, climate change, environmental agroecology, migration, and economic justice. She lives in Brandington, loves her garden, and practice yoga. So thank you so much, Nadia, for joining us today in this panel.
Thank you, Khushbu. And like I have the honor to represent our next speaker. So from Armenia, Arpine Galfayan joined us. Arpine is an environmental activist. She is a member of Armenian Environmental Front. Arpine has also been conducting trainings on civic disobedience, on different issues connected with civil society, especially problems connected with our ecology and environment. Arpine is also interested in feminist resistance and also anti-capitalist rebellions. It is very important to mention, like as our all participants, Arpine has not only theoretical knowledge but also practical experience, which I think will be very useful for us to speak today about, because we're also going to give a small emphasis on Armenian Velvet Revolution to understand what new opportunities do we have after the revolution and what problems Armenian environmental activists and citizens generally face after the revolution. And our next speaker is Benjamin Joaillier from Geneva. He is member of Jai Jagat Initiative. He is the coordinator of Jai Jagat in Geneva and one of the main coordinators of Geneva Forum, which unfortunately was postponed because of COVID-19. Benjamin used to be a consultant to European Green Party. However, he is now outside of Geneva. He is now in French part, but he still continues to work in this field, and most like we can represent him as an environmental activist. So, I think we can start, and we can have, like, in the introduction part, I would like to ask our speakers to speak about the things about which we can speak during the training. We can also speak about COVID-19 because there are some forecasts or predictions according to which people's attitude will be changed to the environment after this COVID-19. Like there are some assumptions that we will try to value or to estimate our environment more than we used to do it before. So you are as people in this sector, in this very important sector, I'm sure you have a lot to share with us. So I think we can start from Nadia, and then go as we started the introduction like part.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity to come and share with the Jai Jagat activists from around the world. As Jill said, I earlier before we started this meeting, Jill Carr-Harris of Ekta Parishad introduced me as an old friend, and indeed I am both old and a friend of Ekta Parishad, and I know a little bit about the work that that you are doing around the world to organize grassroots communities and to support local action for peace and sustainable development. And so when I was asked to say a few words about climate change here, I thought, well, I would talk a little bit about what I have learned from community-based responses to climate change in some of the countries where Christian Aid works. So Christian Aid is an international NGO, as some of you might know, and we work through a partnership approach. So we support the work of local organizations around the world. And so although we are the official development agencies of sponsoring churches in the UK and in Ireland, we work with people and communities of all faiths and no faith. And when it comes to climate change, our approach is to support their resilience. We have this concept of resilience, which is really about helping people to cope with the shocks and the stresses and the issues that they are facing, whether those be related to incremental, slow onset, gradual impacts of climate change, like temperature rises or biodiversity loss, or whether it's to do with coping with the much more hazardous and immediate impacts of climate change, like major cyclones and so on. So we do both of those things, but our approach to resilience recognizes that it's really about as much about people power as it is about having technical approaches. The power of people to cope with climate shocks and stresses is of course about all kinds of things. It's about having equitable access to land and energy and resources. It's about having peaceful and inclusive societies that enable people to invest in their own resilience. It's about having access to education. It's about having social capital, the means to plan for disasters and prepare for them, decent jobs, strong institutions, good governance and environmental management, and all of those things. So we take a very holistic approach to tackling climate change. And I guess the main point that I want to make in this introduction is that we think that tackling climate change is as much about politics and people power and community-based activism as it is about science and technical approaches. And whilst Christian Aid also does a great deal of advocacy work around the world, trying to get the rich governments to take a fair share of responsibility for causing climate change and to reduce emissions and to stop investing in fossil fuels and all of that kind of thing, we also have to recognize that climate change is here to stay. A lot of the impacts are already locked in, and a lot of the changes are already being felt, and they're being felt most by people living in poverty, and particularly in the global south. And I think that it's going to be community-based action which is going to be at the heart of tackling those impacts and saving lives and coping with what are going to be some pretty catastrophic impacts for a lot of people. So I'd be happy to tell you a little bit more about some of those actions later. But that is really my sort of introduction and my approach.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you. Now, Ginny.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Ginny and I'm speaking from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And we are part of the Jai Jagat family. And my role has been to set up the Jai Jagat 2020 in the West Midlands area. And I've been fortunate enough to work with the European coordination group. So there's 8 of us, 8 countries across Europe that involves Benjamin, obviously. And together we have looked at how we could combine activity over the 4 pillars of the Jai Jagat. But in particular in England, we were very interested in the climate action and the situation that's happening. And as you probably know, the UK have had a very high COVID death rate. 21,000 people so far have died because we have a very dense population and there was not perhaps enough quick response to how people travel because we're a nation of travelers and we import a lot of food and our economy, I think, is now in what I would call meltdown. All of our airplanes are grounded, all of our transport is grounded. We depend on importing 50% of our food from elsewhere. So our economy is in slowdown, if not go slow, stop. And it's a very interesting moment for us all to think very carefully about how we come out of this lockdown and face many of the issues that Jill said in her response, that the COVID-19 has revealed all the issues of inequality and poverty and climate action better and more forcefully than walking for 5 months, because we now all face it. And I suppose what I'd like to talk about is how did we were only 8 people who came together as a little steering group. How did we partner with other organizations to try and bring awareness of the Jai Jagat? And I would say we're just this much to start, but we have worked with Birmingham Youth Strikers, all the young people in Birmingham, thousands of them took to the streets about the climate over the last year. We've worked with Extinction Rebellion, thousands of people have taken to the streets and used imaginative campaigns to raise awareness of the climate and the need to take action. And we, in a local campaign, we've worked with those 2 local groups and with other Friends of the Earth, Climate Action Network, and a faith group. So we've tried to bring faith leaders together as well as artists. So I'm an arts producer, but I've also brought the Quakers, who have a testimony to faith and to justice, to the table. So we tried to find, as Nadia said, a holistic view of how to approach this quite complex area where we need more than just politicians finding solutions. So it's about engagement with citizens, with young people, and faith and artists. So that's what I'd like to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It was very informative from you, and it is very necessary how you explain that all the stakeholders should be part in this situation where we talking about the climate crisis and environmental situation. So moving forward, we have Benjamin with us.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Okay, hello dear friends, thanks a lot for this very interesting session. So just a few words of introduction to tell you very quickly where I'm from. I'm freelance journalist and also coordinator of Jai Jagat in Geneva for 2 years now. I've also been an ecological activist at the French and the European levels for more than 15 years, which led me to work notably for the Green Group in the European Parliament for several years. So just let me emphasize one thing about climate change. I would like to just to start with this idea that climate change and the explosion of inequalities are two sides of the same coin. I would like to develop this idea, in fact, because the issue of climate change is therefore essential for me and has been for a long time, but climate change must never be separated from another equally fundamental issue, that of justice, social justice for all human beings, but far beyond that for all living beings on our planet. For ecology, the whole and must strive to think as such rather than by separating things as modern science tends to do. And because the first victim of climate change and more generally of the global ecological crisis are usually the poorest and most fragile people. So climate change and inequality are indeed doubly linked. Generally speaking, both at the level of countries and individuals, the less wealthy are the most vulnerable to climate change, while the wealthiest are responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. There is therefore a kind of double jeopardy. Those who suffer the most from the impacts of climate change are those who contribute the least to the problem. Even though the effects of climate change, heat waves, drought, rising sea levels also affect rich countries. So the so-called rich or developed countries are responsible for nearly 70% of the accumulation of greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution, and emissions are today still very much linked to the GDP of countries. Today, on a global scale, the richest 10% are responsible for about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, while the poorest 50% account for only 10% of emission. So the poorest people on this planet are therefore doubly victimized, and it is twice as unfair. So I wanted to start by that, the global idea about climate change, but very linked to the inequality in the planet. Thank you.
Alpine, so it's now your turn. I think our audience waits to hear especially about the situation that we have after the revolution, about our ecological problems, about our environmental issues. So, thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Actually, I didn't know Jai Jagat much. Maybe I'm the person least connected to it as of now. When Jai Jagat was walking through Armenia, it was exactly the time when in India there were the protests going against Citizenship Amendment Act, and there was huge violence towards the Muslim population going on there. And I knew about these two things, and I was feeling very kind of how unfair everything is, that the march is spreading the message of non-violence, and this horrible violence is going back there in India. And then I started to read more about Jai Jagat actually at that time. And at the same time, there are all around the world, millions of people were in the streets during these 3 or 4 months against neoliberal policies. There were very large protests all over the world, basically in France, in Chile, in Taiwan, in Lebanon, everywhere. There was the Extinction Rebellion, the Fridays for Future, really very powerful movements talking about inequalities and about the climate crisis. And there was this hope rising in me that maybe this is the time when actually something big is going to happen. And then the COVID-19 came, which locked us all in our homes and changed a lot in the way that we exist and in the ways that we struggle. Well, now today my input will be more focused on Armenia, on what happened 2 years ago, called the Velvet Revolution, and how it is connected to the environmental struggles, and what we face now in the environmental front 2 years after the revolution. And of course, my point of view comes from a country which doesn't produce much emissions, but which is more like a resource for exploitation for the first world, let's say, or for the developed world. So the general population is not so conscious about the climate crisis, but of course the environmental issues are something which affect us every day, and they are greatly connected to the health, to our to the economic situation of the people, to the social justice situation, etc. And I'll stop here. Thank you. Maybe just also to add that the Armenian Environmental Front, where I am involved, it is a grassroots activist group. We are all volunteers there, and we do several things. We do some research, we voice out the critical environmental issues around the country, and we also do community mobilization and a lot of door-to-door work and organizing nonviolent protest, etc. Thank you.
So I thank you for introductions. Really, we have very good relations with timekeeping. We have very good results. So we can now go to our main parts, the body of our discussion, and I would like our speakers to introduce their main maybe concerns or suggestions, and so the main actual topics on which you are concentrated and in which to your mind are really important now. Nadia, I think we can start from you.
Okay, thanks. Well, firstly, I'd just like to mention that my colleague from Christian Aid, Jo Mountford, has joined us, and she's listening in, and she is an expert on that international advocacy work I mentioned. So the work that we are doing in the UNFCCC, and to build a sort of global movement, particularly to get investors to take money out of fossil fuel investment around the world. So if anyone would like to hear about that later, Jo is with us. But I was going to talk about something, or the sort of the other side of our work, really. And I was wondering how to link what I was going to say to the Velvet Revolution. And I began to think about one time when I was in the Philippines, and I was with a community organizer of an urban poor community, and he was texting madly on his mobile phone. And at the time, I wasn't so used to mobile phones. It was a long time ago, and I said, "Wow, you do this really quickly, and you're in touch with all these people." And he said, "Yes, we are arranging to lobby our local government unit about a seawall to protect a community that is at risk of rising sea levels in the Philippines." And he said, since the people power revolution in the Philippines, when we overthrew the Marcos regime, this is how people in the Philippines have organized themselves. This is how we keep in touch. And they were really, it was just so impressive how he was able to reach out to activists and mobilize them and get them to come to this meeting and lobby the local governments and get the seawall. And so I began to realize just how much we can learn from community activists in countries, especially in the Philippines, where the level of activism and community organization is really, really impressive. So I'm going to start to say a little bit about the Philippines. And one of the things that Christian Aid has done there is to link people, communities who are at risk of climate change impacts to scientists. So our partners in the Philippines range from everything from sort of tiny community-based organization living in sort of urban slums, maybe small groups of women who are very at risk of floods, right through to, we had a partner there called the Manila Observatory, which is a scientific and research organization. And we have helped to link the two. The importance of linking people to scientists is to enable them to have the evidence they need to be able to convince their governments about the need for appropriate responses. So of course, scientific knowledge is really useful, but it's interesting how the knowledge also flows in the opposite direction. When you link scientists to people, they also learn. So an example of that is when our partner organization, the Manila Observatory, which is based in a university in Manila, did some work with urban poor community groups to map which bits of the city are most at risk of flooding and other impacts of climate change. And the aim was to get a really high resolution picture of what's going on and what's needed and who's most at risk. Because if you don't do that, the poorest people are kind of invisible, and governments don't know what's needed to protect them. And it was also a way of helping communities to figure out what their priorities were. So, you know, do they need to move their settlements or raise their homes to get them out of the way of floods, and that kind of thing. So there's a whole documentation about that on the Facebook site of Christian Aid Philippines. But that linking to scientists and making sure that the knowledge about climate change flows both ways is one of the points I wanted to make. And as someone said earlier, people might not know very much about, you know, climate science, but they know what's happening to their local environment. And it's always struck me that whenever I've traveled and met with communities in the Global South, how much they really know about what's going on with their environment. They know that if they cut down the trees, their ponds where they save water for the dry season will dry out more quickly, for example. You know, and this kind of knowledge is really also useful to inform scientists and government responses. So that's a little bit about the urban communities. I'm also just going to mention about the work in rural areas in the Philippines, because as you probably know, it's a country of 7,000 islands, and some of them are really, really tiny. And it might seem quite idyllic to live on a small tropical island, but really some of these islands are incredibly vulnerable because, you know, they have a small strip of level land, very little, and then mountains in the background. And so there's nowhere much to go if the island gets struck by a cyclone or a serious storm surge, you know, when the sea level rises very dramatically because of low pressure during a cyclone. And so small island resilience has been a big part of our work in the Philippines. And again, it's been very much informed by community priorities. So our partners in the Philippines have developed a sort of approach to small island resilience, which really takes account of the fact that they're living in places which are quite dependent on natural resources, often cut off from the outside world, because if the seas are dangerous, you know, the boats can't reach the small islands. So they're economically isolated, and they face a lot of climate uncertainty and a lot of risks. But not only that, but they're also kind of often victims of unsustainable development like mining or plantation agriculture, which is really, really destructive on small islands and adds to the risks because these activities destabilize mountain slopes, they add to the risk of landslides, they also create water pollution, which damages coral reefs, which is what their fishing industries depend on. So focusing on much more on challenging unsustainable kinds of development. And the restoration of ecosystems is also a really important part of that, combined with community-based organizing and preparation for when the worst happens and there's a cyclone. So people are setting up safe zones where they have maybe a shelter, they have supplies ready, and they have already worked out ways of, they map who in their communities are most vulnerable, who might need help to move quickly if there is a disaster or a cyclone on its way, so that they're, as a community, they are able to make sure that everyone can get out of harm's way when a disaster strikes. I think perhaps I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to also mention that all of these small community-based organizations that are doing these kinds of activities are networked in the Philippines, and it's an incredibly impressive level of organization that they have. They have a disaster risk reduction network, and over the years that has combined and lobbied to ensure that the Philippines has a comprehensive disaster risk reduction law in the Philippines, and also a means of financing small-scale, local, appropriate responses to climate change through something called a People's Survival Fund. So it's really very impressive, and I think we can all learn from that. I think my time's up probably, but if you'd like me to share more from other contexts, then I'd be very happy to do so later.
Thank you, Nadia, for your incredible speech, and this was really very interesting. We also got some information about Philippines' political history, political background, as well as geography. And I think the part of network was really very important. I think that as we here, we have, and Jai Jagat gives us that opportunity to have international speakers, to know new people, to have new acquaintances. Maybe this can serve as an opportunity to have an international network as well, because like climate change is a global challenge, and as we are doing the same job, like with differences connected with objective conditions or subjective, which we have in our countries. But mostly we try to, try to address problems which like are the same. So if we do it together, it will be, I think, easier. So maybe we can use this platform to have new ties, new connections, and try to work together. So this like as an opinion from me. Genia, I think you can go forward. From Philippines to Great Britain, big destination.
Philippines to the United Kingdom in Birmingham, a bit of a leap.
Yeah.
So I will just describe Birmingham was one of the cities of the car. So while we could be said to be the Detroit of the UK, we built motorbikes, airplanes, and cars. So as a city, we obviously, what a surprise, have high pollution of air and high pollution and density of car usage. So while we may have a strong network of committed activists that included young people to take a climate emergency law before the City Council last year, to admit that there is a climate emergency and we needed to do something. I hate to tell you, but here we are a year later with not very much completed. No strategy, no clarity of what the next steps could be or how we could do it. So I think it is, it's a very big risk that we all face if we try to make up the solutions by ourselves. And for this interview, I took some research and spoke to both Ian Bray, who was one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, and to Andrea Sprocker, who is, who Benjamin knows, who's done so much work with other cities to find both the activist route and the pragmatic route, because I think we do need to share how some of the common areas of waste pollution, of air pollution, of city and transport, which are faced by many European countries and cities together. And I'm sure Delhi would fit into that, and Bangalore as well. And I think it's not simple to try and come up with solutions that one size fits all, but to understand some of the ways of mobilizing action that involves politicians as well as citizens. And Ian Bray from Extinction Rebellion was very interesting to me in saying that in the way they created Extinction Rebellion, that is being led and was founded out of a social movement in the 70s, 80s. You know, there's a long history here. It didn't just grow out of nowhere. They also were very clear to not try and create the same silo thinking. They didn't want to have a hierarchical top-down organization. They wanted to engage with activists that could, by themselves in small groups, take action. They wanted to understand that challenging the norm was important, so that if people could take action, it became, as he said, normalized, so that it isn't something to be seen as breaking the law. It's about challenging and making it normal for people to take climate seriously. And I think he described the first time it was about the Heathrow Airport extension, when they first took an action and they went into the offices of Greenpeace, and they had to have enough people to commit to going. So they had 100 people, and they asked for one thing only as a result of that. And they asked for Greenpeace to send round an email to everybody about the climate change and the issues facing the extension of Heathrow. And the only one person that took it up seriously was Georges Monbiot, with a Twitter feed of 30,000 people. So he sent it round his Twitter feed. So already in one email, 30,000 people understood the seriousness and the intention behind that Greenpeace takeover. So that when it came to building the next activity in London on 2018, 100,000 people turned up. So you have to think in terms of scaling up, how you take a small action, how you build to the next, and you take time between one action and the other to think, who do you need to work to? Who do you need to point towards, so that your action is clearly about air pollution or travel or something, so that it's very targeted. And one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion was himself, somebody who looked at campaign organizing as well as a scientist. So you bring people across a range of activities and you put them together in the same room, so they come up with alternative solutions. And the other thing I would say was very interesting with Andrea. She worked a lot with actually taking a group, a particular place in Austria, and I would say this was very interesting, Vorarlberg State in Austria, that had themselves in the 70s decided to become nuclear free. And the lobbying of becoming nuclear free in that state helped mobilize communities to know how to take their energy and saving energy and reversing a direction of travel for being dependent on oil, being dependent on fossil fuels. And they embedded that in their citizens, in their communities, and they engaged it as a social movement that everybody committed to saving energy and finding new solutions. And it was that combination of citizens, social movement, and a way of finding solutions, which I think is similar to Extinction Rebellion, because they allowed everybody to be artistically with their own license. I mean, apparently these artists who found the pink boat and drove it into London Central Square, that nobody had asked them to do it. The police didn't stop them, and suddenly the pink boat arrived. You know, it was like that slightly anarchistic version of how do you get people's creativity to be involved. But I think it has to embed with a social understanding of, if we mean change, we all have to commit to it and say, this is what we need. And that's, for me, the big lesson out of this lockdown time, is that we need to really come up with different strategies that says, if all of those airplanes are grounded, we know from our science that 30% of our air pollution has dropped. 30%, and it's in 5 weeks. That's an incredible drop. And for London, that is unheard of. And we have got no transport running around. We've got no ways of being able to meet and greet and go to the theatre. But what we do have is time to think now about how do we embed that way of living and surviving and make something happen that's better. So for us in Birmingham, what we're trying to do is work with this task force for the City Council, because we're very worried that in the COVID situation that we're in, everybody is very focused on, quite rightly, the medical intervention. How do we keep the National Health Service going? How do we keep people safe and stop them from dying, which is what's happening. You know, it's a spread of disease that we've never had since the Second World War. But the problem is that that's related, as we know, with a climate injustice. We didn't care for the earth. We didn't care for each other and for the animals and for the way in which we live on this planet. So we have underneath it a huge climate shift of how we prioritize our care for the earth and for each other. So for us, we have to work with politicians. We have to find new ways of buddying up with other cities. So we would want to work with Geneva. Through Benjamin, we got the mayor of Geneva to be interviewed. We were able to look at saying with Andrea, could we now look at another network where we don't have to reinvent the wheel from the beginning, but we say, why don't we try and work across with each other, with other cities, build that connection so that we learn and share our ideas and not just reinvent a wheel. But it's simpler said than done. But I say, here in Birmingham, we're trying. And I would say, you know, along with Extinction Rebellion, who would have known 2 years ago we'd have that number of people jumping around on pink boats and telling us how to do things differently. But it's Greta to be thankful for. It's the young people who've been to the streets and who've inspired us. And so we can't go back to business as usual. We have to find ways in which we embed this learning and we work together to find new solutions. So I suppose that's what I would say. In our little way, we have two in our group, two very keen vegan activists. So I also, in our small research, we've been looking at how to take Britain, which is very, very fixated on meat and dairy, and how do we use our land differently to grow more vegetables and to eat and feed ourselves in a more healthy way. We must be, I think, the second most obese country, second to America. So, I mean, we're unhealthy and we can do a lot by eating vegetables and becoming healthier. So, you know, we've got a long way to go, but we can do it with the creativity. That's one thing we can do. So I hope that gives you an idea, and other people now will speak. Thank you.
Khushbu, you can go forward.
Okay, so thank you so much, Jenny. And I have just one reflection that whatever you say about that, after the lockdown, we have seeing significant improvement in environment. So I just want to share that in India also we have seen some very significant improvements, like whether it is about air quality or the pollution level or the water bodies. So yeah, so this is the worldwide situation, and it is somehow a good news. which comes with this lockdown. So moving forward, now let's hear from Benjamin.
Yeah, thank you, Khushbu. And thank you also, Ginny. I'm a vegetarian, not totally vegan, but vegetarian activist. So thanks. I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in general again, because I would like to speak now about the coronavirus, because I think we have to learn 2 lessons about the lockdown and the coronavirus right now, which is very important for the next step. Because it's linked to the climate change and the explosion of inequalities, which has 2 sides of the same coin. So the coronavirus, in fact, is accentuating this reality. Sorry for my accent. In this month of April 2020, we are nearly 4 billion people confined to our homes, half of the world population. COVID-19 has now been detected in 187 countries. To date, it had caused 211,000 dead worldwide, of which more than 85% in Europe and the United States. But while these figures are impressive, they can nevertheless be compared with other figures, such as the fact that 815 million people still suffer from malnutrition in the world, that 3.1 million children under the age of 5 die every year because of it. And since 1st January, for example, more than 2.4 million people have already died of hunger in the world. So COVID-19 has made it possible to bring down a certain number of fables or fake news with which our rulers and other experts had been working us for decades, such as 2, in fact. There is no alternative, you know, Tina, and the trickle-down effect. So let me explain that. First of all, it is clear that faced with the advance of the pandemic, it was possible to abandon, in Europe, for example, we have abandoned European budgetary rigor and its impassable 3% deficit frontier overnight, and rediscover the benefits of state intervention in the economy and the interest of functioning public services, particularly in the area of health. So no, there is no alternative, or TINA does not exist. And in politics and in economy, everything is possible when there is the will to do so. And concerning the trickle-down effect, which is supposed to make everyone, including the most precarious, benefit from the enrichment of the richest, the scam is even more blatant here. While the majority of employees in France and in Europe are seeing their incomes fall, many shareholders of large companies are still being granted dividends in a cynicism worthy of the finest mafias. So no, the enrichment of the wealthiest does not benefit everyone, but rather always comes at the expense of the most fragile. So let us thus grant COVID-19 the quality of shedding more light on a now undeniable reality, denounced in recent months long before the disease by thousands of people all over the world. You spoke about it, but from Chile to Hong Kong, from Algeria to Lebanon, via Ecuador, Iraq, or even France, with our movement of yellow vests or yellow jackets. So we live in a profoundly inegalitarian global economic system whose inequality is even at the heart of its functioning, benefiting only a few privileged people to the detriment of all, and primarily the most excluded of globalization, whose numbers are only increasing. Refugees, climate exiles, workers without rights, homeless people surviving in the heart of our cities. So to sum up, we live in a world where the planet is getting warmer and at the same time inequalities are exploding. So the political lesson to be learned from the coronavirus may be this: we are all interdependent within the living. The way we treat an individual of a particular species in one part of the world can cause multiple upheavals on the other side of the planet. So if this health crisis is ultimately just a blip in the road before we resume our criminal exploitation of life on the altar of our individual comfort, we have understood nothing again. So the climate is our common good. If we deregulate it permanently, everyone on the planet will be affected. The fate of the poorest is therefore also ours. So I just want to finish with, I will finish now because I have a sentence from Satish Kumar to share with you after that. Thank you.
Alpine, so I think so now you can speak like I think you can know about what we want to listen, but at the same time I would like maybe to hear some emphasis on pre-revolutionary period, like Amulsar issue is, I think, very important. Maybe our international friends have heard about it or not, and so that's it. Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you very much. It was everything that Nadia and Ginny and Benjamin were speaking resonated a lot with my heart. And now the activist group where I'm involved, it's also a non-hierarchical group. Ginny was telling about Extinction Rebellion and how it comes from the experience of back from the 70s. So it is a little bit similar here as well. I don't know how it happened, but since the end of the 80s, there were also always large environmental movements connected to the political movements, and there were big waves of the environmental movement every 10 years, I would say. And so I got involved in the wave of 2008. And although our group is a small one, I would say, but it has been working consistently for several years. So sometimes we have the feeling that we are doing the work of what the state bodies or other institutions were supposed to do, because we are acting like a hotline. All the people from different parts of the country writing about their issues and asking if we can do something to let them solve them or help them organize, help to organize the local resistances. As I'm speaking now and we are talking about the lockdown and COVID, I just made this comparison that what happened in Armenia 2 years ago was also a kind of a lockdown. In some ways, it was similar to what's happening now because nothing worked as normal. The businesses had stopped, like most of the communication had stopped in the cities especially, but it was a different type of a lockdown because all the people were in the streets, and it was the people who had locked down the government. Sort of the people were free, and the government was trapped and were forced to do something. Honestly, back then I was one of the skeptics, and I didn't believe that I didn't believe that it's going to work out, because the beginning looked like all the other political movements before in the previous 2 decades. But then something changed in the tactics, and instead of coming together in the squares every day, people were encouraged to block the streets, and this change of tactics did a really big thing. And suddenly in a couple of days, I could already feel that, okay, it's not going to be reversed. This government is going to be brought down. So this change in the government system was something that I had wished and longed for many years. But at the same time, me and my comrades, we were very well aware that the political force which is in charge of the movement, they don't have an environmental agenda. The environmental issues are nowhere in their priorities. And also, although there are people in this party which were involved in environmental movements before, this is not going to be enough. And usually, you know, when there is such a big movement with a clear goal of bringing down a political regime, it's really hard to bring in other topics, and everyone wants to be very focused and work for only this goal. But we had experience with social movements before, and we realized it really clearly that if we step back from our agenda, it's not going to happen not going to come to the public agenda by itself. You know, everyone will just forget about the topics. And one of the biggest environmental struggles that we face here is connected with mining. David mentioned one movement. I will come back to it a little bit later. So actually what we did, we continued and even mobilized more and more people around this anti-mining struggle during the days of the Velvet Revolution, and we were often blamed that we shouldn't be doing it. Everyone should focus on the revolution, but we thought that no, we're gonna continue it. So in Armenia, I would say, yeah, because there are a lot of examples of countries which have brought down dictatorships in order to to fall under dictatorship of World Bank and IMF and to face new forms of colonialism. So it was a difficult thing, but I'm proud that we made it happen. And Armenia's environmental situation is generally like as bad as it is anywhere else in the developing world. We face deforestation and desertification and pollution of water and earth. And importantly, there is this mining issue. It's a tiny country, but there are over 400 mining licenses and already 9 billion tons of toxic waste dumped in these tailing reservoirs. They constantly leak into rivers and land, but this doesn't cause strong sanctions to the mining corporations. It only causes health and life to the people and animals and all the beings living there. And mining has the largest export proportion from Armenia, although it provides less than 1% of jobs and less than 3% of the GDP. And unfortunately, during the last 2 years, I can't say that we had big changes. The Minister of the Environment is someone who was involved in the previous regime's government. He was the advisor of the Prime Minister, and he also held a job in the contractor of a mining corporation. We have a finance minister who used to be the financial director of the badly failed mining project in the north of the country. And very quickly, the rhetoric of the prime minister changed, and his speeches about injustices in the mining sector were replaced with calls not to demonize mining. And there was a public official who was maybe the only trusted one by the communities and the environmentalists, and he was fired from his job on the day when he was to publish the result of the inspection of the largest mine in the country. They lobby a lot for the profits of the corporations, and I feel that the environmental branch, let's say in the government at least, is not doing much. And during the last 2 years, we have faced situations where requests for information from the public are ignored. The Minister of Ecology is blackmailing the activists. He's trying to pass a law which will allow the government to keep environmental information secret. They also approved the mining exploration license in a territory of a national park, etc. Yeah. And a little bit about this biggest anti-mining struggle that we face now. It is called Amulsar movement, and it's for the protection of a mountain and a whole area from gold mining, which hasn't started yet. Actually, we had also some international solidarity on that, and people can find about it in Al Jazeera, and also a UK-based Global Justice Now prepared a film about it, and Bankwatch. I don't know if these are familiar, but just to mention. So this is a project of gold mining in the heart of water sources of Armenia, and 6 kilometers away from the most famous mineral water resort in the country. And people, the locals, were protesting against it since the beginning in 2011. Of course, in places which are impoverished for years, there are also always people who want to go to any job that will pay them something. So there were also people who were happy to go and work in the mining, but there was always protest. And in 2018, amidst the Velvet Revolution, the locals started to blockade the entrances to the mining sites, and until now these blockades continue. It's around 2 years already, and they have a big support from the community from all over Armenia, and also international solidarity. And also importantly, like, although I am so unhappy with the governmental policies of Armenia on the environment, there is also a huge environmental pressure. And this company which is involved there, they have their allies in the Armenian government and parliament, but also, for example, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is a shareholder, and the governments of UK and US have been pressuring a lot. Recently, one of my colleagues filed an information request to the UK Foreign Office, asking to provide everything they had collected on her, personal information about her. And we found out that basically throughout these years, at least the last 2 years, the UK embassy was really spying on us and collecting everything we wrote on social media or said publicly, or even some of the emails which were circulated just among the Armenian NGOs appeared also in their documents. And the US Embassy has been threatening to cut Armenia's foreign aid in case Amulsar project, gold project, is cancelled. And the European delegation representatives are kind of repeating the words of the mining corporation and accusing the local activists of being paid by Russia or by the biggest German-owned mine in Armenia. So it's kind of this network of lies, and sometimes it's really hard to see the way out, you know. I think 2 years after the Velvet Revolution, we still have no possibility to relax or to feel safe that a government or someone else will take care of the environment. And the corporate interests are very strong, and the post-colonial practices are still very strong. And it is again up to the communities and to the activists to protect the clean air and water and land. And it is very sad, unfortunately, because in the face of the climate catastrophe, of course, the governments could do a big thing with their policy changes, with directing their money to the protection of the environment or to changing the whole economy. And the COVID pandemic, Benjamin already mentioned that, you know, it showed that it is possible to change things. We were told that it's not possible to shut down factories or the air traffic, but suddenly it all became possible. But also this pandemic showed how unsustainable our economies are. So just a month after the pandemic, people cannot survive, and the poorest are paying the highest costs, of course. And the disaster capitalism, like Naomi Klein says, they always have the recipes for giving more freedom to the corporations and making situation of the normal people worse. So it is really a big time when locked down in our homes, we can try to build a different kind of a movement. For me, it's not really clear what it is going to look like, but the kind of the optimism comes from these international connections that across the borders, people are holding hands to find some solutions and to build up new kinds of resistance. And also that the popular polls in different parts of the world are showing that people start to care more about the climate and about the environment. Yeah, so and in Armenia, I think we'll just go on with our struggle, because the blockade there are continuing, and at least we can work with media, with online media a lot, but it is a really big challenge how to continue the resistance when our bodies are not able to come together. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Atman, and it was very useful for us to now we better understand the situation of Velvet Revolution and environment of Armenia. So moving forward and going before closing, I have one reflection and one question to our panelists. Any of you can answer it. So as a marcher, before joining Jai Jagat as champion, I was thinking that the objective of Jai Jagat is very different. Like the four objectives: poverty, be it inclusion, non-violence, and climate. It's very different from each other. But during our 6 months walk in India, Iran, and Armenia, we could expose ourselves that these are the situation and these are the issues which is very interrelated. So I want to ask you that whether not is this is the situation or this is the time that we need to approach climate as a manifold situation, like a situation and condition. And we, as Arpine said, that many movement of the climate and environment is related to the political movement. So is this a time that we need to relate climate with the other social issues as well? So thank you.
So
if anybody of you can reflect back on that, or you can say in your closing sentence as well. David.
I think we can go to our closing remarks as well as we can answer to Khushbu's question. So we can start from Nadia, and if you have a reflection on the question, you can do it, and also we can go to our closing remarks.
Thank you. Well, I think it's really struck me how much common ground there is between people in completely different contexts and in different parts of the world. I totally agree with Benjamin's point that we have now found that what we were told was impossible is now possible. And that gives us an incredible opportunity to strengthen our movements and to link them up. And I think what Extinction Rebellion has achieved and what the movements and the anti-mining movements in Armenia are doing is all sort of reflections of the same thing. But I do think that yes, when it comes to talking about climate change, it is a holistic issue. It's linked to so many other different things, how we live, how we consume, and I think it's really important to contextualize our responses. So for example, in some countries, climate change it's having its impact, but what people are really concerned about when it comes to building their resilience to climate impacts is land. It might be about land, or it might be about democratic governance, or it might be about ending destructive mining industries. So you need to link the issues to the immediate concerns in people's lives. So I guess I'm sort of harping back to that old saying of think global and act local. So I think that contextualizing it and understanding the complexities and the linkages with all the other issues of sustainable development is really, really important. And also, just to say, I should have said earlier, Christian Aid unfortunately had to exit its programs in the Philippines a couple of months ago after many, many years. But I just wanted to say that because it's not about international NGOs. The work is continuing through our partners and the activists in the Philippines that are still doing it. And it is about social movements, and it is about grassroots activism that can never be closed down, but an NGO can. So yeah, let's continue to talk and build a global movement.
Okay, so I found the range of speakers and the link up really fascinating, and I hope and I applaud you in Armenia for doing it, because I think it's it's something about sharing information in a way that's honest and that should be helping activists like your group in the mining community to take action and not be isolated by the fear of being seen or revealed. It reminded me of the USA mining community, and I'll send it to you afterwards, George Leakey and the Turning the Tide program, but it took them 5 years, if not 10, to close down the mine. So I think what I understand from the research and the more thinking I'm doing about coronavirus is this is a big moment for us to think it's 10 years. We need to think on a 10-year level. We need to join up and not fragment, because to take the Earth seriously, it's, for me, the big issue of our time. It's whether we will be able to survive and whether the planet will be able to survive. In the way that we're going, it's not possible. We're poisoning ourselves and the planet. So I think it's so important for us to join together and to take citizens with us and not just listen to business and politicians who quite often have hand-in-hand investment in the businesses in which they want to profit. So let's be honest about that. And it's up to us to push and to reveal and to tell the truth and not be pushed over by that situation. And I think that takes a lot of courage, but it also takes strategy, and it takes a long-term vision of saying these things are serious and they are the issue of our times, and it will be how we solve and navigate this will be either the future generations can live or will have very reduced circumstances. And I totally agree with Benjamin that it's revealed the have and have nots, and we can't live like that. I can't live with myself with that, and I'm sure many others can't either. So this is our time to stand up, and we must do that.
Benjamin, I think you can maybe have your closing remarks also if you have a reflection on Khushbu's question.
Yeah, thank you, David. I don't know if I have the answer to the Khushbu question about Jai Jagat, but let me just share with you this sentence of Satish Kumar. Satish Kumar says, changing oneself and changing politics are two sides of the same coin. In the face of climate change, we need a vision of the world, a new awareness that is greater than the IPCC reports. Interesting. And this is where I think this is where the Jai Jagat campaign comes into its own. Although the Great Jai Jagat March has been halted for the moment, its two main messages are more relevant than ever. First one, the urgency of a world for everyone, in which no one left behind. If everyone is currently confined to their own homes, they still need to have a home. We are certainly not equal in the face of pandemic, even though we are all interdependent. And second one, change yourself in order to change the world, like Gandhi, whose life was the main message, caring on altruism rather than individualism and competition, of which the Great Yatra was the symbol, in fact. So all those who have mobilized their own Jai Jagat appels in India, Europe, and elsewhere have even more reason to do so today than yesterday. So much so that this pandemic reveals the depths of the gaps that humanity has dug on the walls that it has erected. Walls between the winners of globalization and the mass majority abandoned to its fate. Walls between humans and other species shamelessly slaughtered for consumption and our little comforts. Walls between those who can move freely and all the others, refugees, exiles, sacrificed on the altar of our pity and miserable fears. So more and more of us, we want bridges and not walls. It could be one of our motto. And so more than ever, we must remain mobilized so as not to resume the deadly business as usual, as soon as the pandemic is over, for another possible world. But another world right here, right now, a world for every man. So let me conclude. I would like to see you in Geneva next September, of course, virtually or physically. Physically could be better, but we'll see. And so, Jai Jagat.
Jai Jagat. Arpine, I think
Yes.
you can maybe do your
Very
last
short.
line.
Yes.
Could I just
Yes.
say, I'm sorry, I have to go. My husband needs the Zoom, so I am sorry to say goodbye, but I have to go now. Thank you.
Bye,
Goodbye.
Ginny. Nice to
Bye-bye.
see you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so very shortly about Khushbu's question. Of course, I don't